G'day and welcome to the Powerful Learning channel. I'm Luke Rowe and I have a PhD in the learning sciences and I research and teach in this field for a living. And one of the best parts about my job is that I get to read a lot of books. And in today's episode, I'm going to share with you my thoughts on a wonderfully original, scientifically sound and fun book entitled Stop Talking and Start Influencing 12 Insights from Brain Science to Make Your Message Stick. It's written by my friend and colleague, Dr. Cooney-Horvath, and he's an absolute beast when it comes to the learning sciences. So let's stop talking and start influencing and unlock some of those wonderful brain secrets from his excellent book. Now, he's got 12 different chapters in his book, but we're not going to be able to do an exhaustive review today. Instead, I've picked 3 different topics that I'm going to go through with you. The first of those is connecting the dots through storytelling. So have you ever wondered why it is that some of the world's oldest living civilizations, such as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia, have maintained such a strong tie to their traditions, their beliefs, their customs and their practices? Very much there's a through line from their ancient ancestors right through to today, and it's a fascinating and wonderfully rich culture. One explanation is that those traditions are carried through what is referred to as yarning circles. Yarning circles aren't just about telling tales, but about a communal and holistic approach to intergenerational memory and learning. It's essentially a way for storytelling in which the lessons of the past can communicate with the people of the present. And these yarning circles, they can formalize cultural practices that exploit our brain's desire for storytelling and structure and organizing principles around different, otherwise disparate facts. They use narrative as a way of organizing ideas and making meaning of their histories, the present, their future, and the past, and they bring all those together so they can pass those things down from one generation to the next. Now, without these stories, our brains find it really difficult to bring those disconnected facts and information together in a way that makes sense to us, and in a way that can be remembered, and in a way that can be used to inform our identities and improve our future decisions. And in this book, in Jared's book, he really draws upon this notion of storytelling with a contemporary scientific lens to bear upon the ancient practice of storytelling, and he shows us that we often learn best when we can organize our thinking through the use of vivid stories, analogies, metaphors, and relating different ideas through narrative. The brain loves to make order from chaos, and throughout the history of our species, it's done so with the story as its primary method for organizing those different forms of information into a coherent web of knowledge. And once we have that narrative structure in place, we can go deeper with our learning by injecting into our mental schema, our mental models, various hooks and highlights that really bring to life all of the key parts of the story. They can further enrich and strengthen our memory networks in the process. Now, Jared suggests there are 5 different types of narrative arcs that bring different stories together. And the first of those is the origin stories. They explore the creation of key ideas, like the Pythagorean theorem and its sudden emergence, emphasizing both the how, or say a group of mathematicians developing and exploring those ideas, and the why, so their belief in the numbers as a divine thing. So understanding these origins helps us categorize and personalize knowledge. The second type of narrative arc he refers to is the controversy stories. They involve narratives that delve into significant and unresolved conflicts, such as soldiers rescuing a prisoner of war despite moral ambiguities, challenges and assumptions, and diverse ideas. So they may not always leave you feeling resolved when you listen to those stories or watch those stories. Then there's the application stories. They tend to focus on practical uses of knowledge, like repurposing fishing gear to remove ocean rubbish, or inspiring creativity and real-world problem solving. The fourth type of narrative arc he refers to is the humanizer, and that offers stories from personal lives of the presenter or the author to enhance audience engagement and personalize the learning experience. And the fifth and final narrative arc that he refers to is the cliffhanger, and we're all familiar with this. This is where stories build to a climax, potentially without immediate resolution. They spark your curiosity, encourage the audience to lead the discovery and follow up with the story based on the cliffhanger, enticing you to the next link in that chain. Now, when I read this section of Jared's book, I naturally got very curious and did some additional reading, and I found some awesome publications on this fascinating topic of narrative structures that I think can really help you formulate an unforgettable story. And these lessons come from the Humanizer project. The key findings of this project can be found in an excellent paper by Regan and colleagues, published in 2016, where their analysis found 6 fundamental emotional arcs that tend to exist in all stories and across all cultures and times. These include number 1, rags to riches stories or rising stories. Number 2, tragedy stories or riches back to rags or the falling story. Number 3, man in a hole or the fall to rise story. Number 4, the Icarus story, the rise back to fall. And number 5, the Cinderella story, the rise, fall and rise again. Or the Oedipus story, the fall, then the rise, then the fall again. If this kind of thing interests you, then I highly recommend that you check out the Humanizer website. They've updated it since their 2016 publication, where you can visualize the narrative arcs of dozens of popular stories and novels and look at important narrative analysis done by their research team. So highly recommend that. It's a brilliant website. Check it out. Now, one of the questions that you might be asking yourself right now is, why is it that stories tend to stick so deeply in our minds? Now, Jared offers us 3 different suggestions, and I quote from page 227 of his book. First, as we learned in the last chapter, ensuring people are on the same page and the right page can guide how everyone interprets and remembers new ideas. One of the greatest methods to achieve this is to tell a compelling and relevant story that weaves together previously learned ideas with upcoming concepts. Second, due in part to oxytocin, a story can help others feel more at ease and willing to learn from you. Furthermore, thanks to neural coupling, this can also improve the chance of others understanding novel concepts in the manner that you desire. Third, mental simulation has been shown to boost engagement. As we've seen before, engagement does not equal learning. As such, we can't expect stories to carry the entire burden. However, if a story is followed up by solid teaching, possibly underpinned by techniques explored throughout this book, then this enhanced engagement can motivate people to devote time and energy to learning. So the bottom line is, if you want to make those memories burn into your brain, you need to be able to tell a good story or organize your thinking around a good narrative arc. You can take a leaf out of the book of our Indigenous Australians and invite your students or your friends or those you want to influence into a good yarning circle so that they can share their stories and tap into that lean, mean storytelling machine between your ears and between their ears as well. Now, one of the best qualities about Jared's book is that each chapter ends with a set of practical implications. So here's how he finishes this chapter on the power of storytelling to maximize our impact. He offers several key implications. The first of them is that we should open our books and our presentations and our whatever we're writing and trying to communicate with a compelling story. This helps orientate the listener or the reader, and it grabs their attention immediately. Second thing is that Jared argues the stories contain 3 elements: a physical thrust, a psychological thrust, and an audience, so a tailored aspect for the audience. And effective storytelling needs to address each of those factors. The third thing is that when telling a story, how you feel often translates to how your audience feels. Your feelings are often emotionally contagious. The fourth point that Jared makes is that our first stories can really make a lasting, potentially everlasting impression on our listeners, on our audience, on our readers. So make sure your initial impressions count. The fifth point that he makes is that we must ask others to share their own stories, to get involved in the storytelling, to personalize their storytelling experiences and connect their stories to your story. The sixth point and the final point he makes is that we need to match our stories to our audiences by making sure we speak to their interests, their passions, and their current situation. So no egocentric storytelling, but a story that really reaches our audience. Now, the second part of Jared's book that I wanted to include in this review is on chapter 5, the idea of multitasking. Now, have you ever thought that you're acing the idea of multitasking by juggling a whole heap of things at once? Maybe you're sending an email while writing a text, you're doing plenty of things, working simultaneously, having a conversation with someone else, or perhaps you're just studying while you've got the TV on in the background. Or if you're like me, you've got the headphones on, you're listening to music while you're typing out really important documents. You think you're being really effective, but according to Jared's book, he's here to remind us that we might be incredibly wrong about those assumptions. And Jared reminds us in this chapter that instead of multitasking, what we're actually doing is completing multiple tasks in rapid succession. And this is called task switching. And we're often thinking that we're doing it more quickly and more effectively than we actually are, at least for cognitively taxing tasks like learning something new. So at that point, you're probably doing it far more inefficiently, yet you're under the impression that you're doing it extremely well because you're distracted from your errors. So let's briefly follow Jared's lead and dive into why this common practice isn't as effective as you think, based on some of the insights from his book. The first point to make is that contrary to popular belief, our brains can't handle multiple tasks at once. Jared suggests that this is similar to how a video game console operates on one set of rules at a given time. Our brain, specifically the lateral prefrontal cortex, toggles between tasks and never manages them concurrently. So there's no parallel distributed processing for things that we're totally focused on with learning new tasks or novel tasks. And this constant shifting is called task switching, as I mentioned before, and our subjective experience often makes it feel like we're multitasking. So it's a bit of a cognitive illusion. And it's more akin, though, to using a remote control and flipping between different movies while you're on television, sitting on the couch, where you get a glimpse of many different movies, but you don't comprehend any of them. Right? So you're just switching between all of them, touching the surface of all of those sources of information, but not mastering any of them. Now, this leads to at least 3 key costs to our learning that Jared talks about. The first cost is the time loss involved in that. So let me read from Jared's book, and I quote, "Every switch has a hidden cost, the attentional blink. This is a brief moment when our brains pause between switches, creating a sensory blackout where no new information is processed. Although each blink is short, the more you switch, the more cumulative time you lose, making task switching far less efficient than focusing on one task at a time." The second cost that Jared refers to is decreased accuracy. He says this, "Task switching can blur the boundaries between activities, leading to errors. Ever found coffee in your cereal instead of milk? Or typed a message meant for a conversation? These mishaps stem from the psychological refractory period where our performance drops as our brain struggles to handle the overlap of tasks." And the third and final cost that we incur as a result of multitasking is the cost of impaired memory and learning. Multitasking negatively impacts the functionality of our hippocampus, a central part of our brain's memory systems. So it's unsurprising that it leads to a reduction in our capacity to form new memories. At the same time, it increases activity in the striatum, which handles habitual actions. Thus, the information learned while multitasking often becomes less accessible for active and explicit recall later. So instead of processing in explicit declarative memories in semantic networks in our brain, we implicitly encode that memory. And so it's often very much difficult to retrieve that. Now, this has a number of potentially serious real-world implications that Dr. Cooney-Horvath reminds us of. One of those is around the idea of multitasking while you're driving. So imagine you're driving, you look down at your mobile phone, and all of a sudden you see out the corner of your eye a tail and 4 legs roll under your car. And you've just hit someone's dog because you've taken your attention away from the road onto your phone for that split second. right? So it can happen in a very small instant, and that's why we ban mobile phones while we're driving in most countries around the world. Another common scenario where multitasking can really hurt us is in our learning and academic performance. For example, rapid task switching happens all the time when we're sitting there replying to notifications on our computer screens or on our emails or on our phones while we're sitting there trying to read and engage in deep learning, right? But all of those factors can interrupt the attention, the encoding, and the storage and retrieval of information. So every link across the learning chain, multitasking hurts that. And there's also plenty of research to show that engaging in commonplace behaviors such as studying while listening to music or texting your friend or using social media to read someone's post or flick through a few images while you're trying to study can lead to much poorer comprehension and retention of that information. Jared highlights a common finding of research in this field where it shows that students who engage in frequent task switching or multitasking during study sessions tend to have far lower academic performance compared to their peers who dedicate exclusive focus on their studies and just fail to be disrupted by all those distractions around them. So focus always wins when studying. And it's because the cognitive load that we place on our limited working memory when we start engaging in this task switching leaves less mental resources for our attention to be devoted to the studying and the understanding and comprehension of that material. And if this kind of multitasking goes on too long, as we get chronically addicted to our phones, for example, we can learn some incredibly bad habits that tempt us away from finishing what we start. Students who develop an over-reliance on social media can develop a deep-seated hunger for constant stimulation, which can diminish our capacity to sustain attention across long stretches of time, or to engage in material beyond our impulse to quit. So instead of persevering beyond that impulse to quit, we walk away because we're so used to rapidly switching between tasks, we don't want to see it through. Right? So we want to train our brains to persevere in the face of distractions. And when we engage in multitasking, it's doing the exact opposite of that. The next principle of learning and influence comes from chapter 4 of Jared's book. And this refers to the power of context. This includes anything to do with the learning context itself, both inside and outside. For example, it could be the noises that we hear, so background music when we're learning, it could be the psychological state or the emotional state we're feeling when we experience and engage in that initial learning, or it could be the places and locations that we're in when we encode those memories and shape those memories in the first place. For example, let's talk about this idea of space and location. Have you ever walked into a room and upon walking in there immediately remembered something that you'd previously done or thought about in that room? That's because our brains tend to link the memories of the physical location in the space we're in with the information that was encoded during our experience in that space. And this can be really powerful when studying because you could potentially use that to your advantage by closely matching your studying environment when you're encoding the information during study with the performance environment, say the test-taking environment where you have to do the high-stakes exam, the high-stakes test, or the high-stakes performance. So closely matching that will ensure that when you're in that high-stakes setting, that you've got a whole range of retrieval cues that are embedded in that location. So when you hop in there, you get the flood of memories back from when you were studying in that environment. To help illustrate this point, Jared mentions a famous study, the scuba diving study of the 1970s conducted by Godden and Baddeley. And in this experiment, the researchers asked a group of divers to memorize a list of words, either on land or, believe it or not, underwater with the scuba diving gear on. The divers were asked to recall the words in either the same environment in which they encoded it in, where they learned those words, or in the opposite environment. So going onto land if they learned it underwater, or vice versa. And the results were incredible. Those who had learned in a condition that matched their recall conditions actually outperformed those for where there was a mismatch between where they had initially learned and encoded the information versus where they were asked to recall the word list. So for those who memorized and recalled the lists underwater in the first place and then recalled later the performance condition where they had to recall the words in the water, they remembered 35% more words on that word list compared to those who initially encoded the word list on land and then were tested underwater. The experiment's since become a classic in the field of psychology, and it really epitomizes this idea of context-dependent learning, where we build potent retrieval cues in our environment so that we can aid subsequent recall when we're re-immersed in the same environment in which we studied and learned that material. Now let's move on to the idea of sound. In his book, Jared discusses how background noise can either be a distraction or an aid to memory and recall. For example, many of us can relate to the experience of hearing a song and having memories flood back to the front of our mind, or being transported back to a romantic or sentimental moment of our past. And that's because the sound can act as a powerful trigger for what we call episodic autobiographical memory. Jared suggests that leveraging these triggers can be done by intentionally associating the key information with specific sounds or music to enhance learning. So anchoring the retrieval cues in rhythm or in the sound or in the song itself. However, on the flip side, some of the research actually suggests that you might want to avoid listening to music while you're studying, particularly with new ideas and complex concepts, because that can cause us to commit the multitasking errors that we covered in the previous section. And what about our emotional or psychological states? Well, Dr. Cooney-Horvath emphasizes that the mental states in which we learn something new, say the emotional state that we're in, the time of day and our bodily clock, even the role of the weather, can all act as state-dependent retrieval cues that influence how we effectively recall information at a later point in time. Jared provides the example of a PowerPoint presentation where the traditional blend of pictures and bullet points of written words might not be as effective as we had initially thought. He argues that it's possible that only a picture is needed to enhance the viewer's learning experience during a PowerPoint presentation, as too much text can hinder or distract from the audience's capacity to listen to and focus on the words of the speaker. And this is an especially important cautionary tale in situations where the audience is expected to do both, that is, to listen to the speaker at the same time as reading the written bullet points on the PowerPoint slides. Remember that whether we listen to words or hear them spoken through sound, all end up competing for the same mental real estate in your auditory processing complex, especially the Wernicke's region and the anterior cingulate gyri, where those integration circuits are there trying to process that bottleneck. And that's one of the reasons why we tend to be less efficient at bringing information in and encoding it in a reliable and accurate fashion while people are speaking the same words that are written on screen, because they're competing for the same space in your brain and they're not being read internally at the same pace and with the same cadence as the person speaking those very words. So Chapter 4 on context-dependent learning is obviously not just about theory. It's jam-packed with practical tips. And as with other chapters in his book, Jared summarizes all of the key application points at the end of the chapter. He's got 5 suggestions for you. The first, he says, and I quote, is that where people practice and how they feel during practice form an integral aspect of what they learn. He goes on to suggest that the external environment, such as physical and sensory cues, enter into all new memories. That is known as context-dependent memories. Likewise, he reminds us that the internal environment, that is the chemicals and the emotions that flood our brains during our psychological and emotional experiences, enter into new memories. And this is known as state-dependent memories. In applying these lessons to real-world scenarios, Jared suggests we do the following. He says that for one-off performances, we should match the training context with the performance context. For example, if you've got a singing audition that you want to absolutely nail, then practice in the same location and room and at the same time of day as your audition. So match the context as closely as possible. However, if you're expected to perform in multiple settings with multiple applications, you should seek to mix up your training context as much as possible so that your learning is not context dependent, but instead is context independent or context free, so it's robust to the different contexts. For example, if I'm a medical student and I'm expected to reproduce my medical knowledge in different hospitals or different clinical settings, then I need to make sure that I can practice across a variety of settings, bring that information to the novel context so that my context and state-dependent memory and retrieval cues aren't confined to any one location or any one state of mind, that they're transferable to every location and every state of mind. The next thing Jared suggests that we do is to leverage our senses to reinstate our memory. For example, you can use background music to solicit an old sentimental memory, or if you've used a song as a mnemonic to retrieve, say, all the planets in our solar system, these are the types of things that we can use as retrieval cues or mnemonic devices to improve our memories. And with that being said, we should remind ourselves that foreground music and music that's highly complex and jam-packed with words, or is just rich in novelty, that can grab at far too much of our limited sources of attention, and therefore it can impair our learning through those distractions. And this has meant that one of my bad habits, listening to rap music while studying or reading, had to be canned. I had to put that habit to bed and say no more to that. Despite the fact that I really enjoyed it, it was hindering my learning. And a little reminder that no, the Mozart effect is not real. So don't listen to classical music to try and improve your memory and intelligence. It is not going to work at all. So sorry to spoil your plans of making your children little Einsteins by playing them Mozart all day long. Not going to work. Jared also suggested that context-dependent memories can be used by marketing experts, so they can exploit that to boost your recognition of their brand using, say, consistent color schemes or logos, or even little sound devices like jingles every time that you hear the name of a company or brand. And the final implication that Jared offers in this chapter is to beware of becoming too bound up in context or state-dependent learning effects, because they can limit our ability to transfer our knowledge from one setting to another. So if you're wanting to maximize the robustness and the rigor of your learning, then you've got to practice in as many contexts and under as many conditions as possible so that you cross the threshold of context-free learning, right? So that you're no longer context-dependent in your learning, so that you don't have to feel a particular way or be in a particular room or in a particular psychological state to be effective at bringing the knowledge and skills to the fore. So what are my overall impressions about this book? Well, it's one of my favorite books on the learning sciences, and I think it's massively underrated. I think it should be a bestseller. It's got the quality of a bestseller, but I don't think enough people quite know about it yet, which is partly why I wanted to bring this book to people's attention through this video. And with that being said, it's certainly not a perfect book, and what good would a book review be if I only told you about the good bits and I didn't mention any of those bits that I found to be challenging? Now, the first issue that I had was that I wanted to buy this book in audio format, but I couldn't find it anywhere on the Audible website, where I generally, if I read a book and I really like it, I'll generally get an audio copy so I can reinforce the lessons of that book and listen to it while I'm doing a workout, taking the dog for a walk. So Jared, please adapt this book to audio format. I know you're going to have to do some creative tricks in how to bring some of those thought experiments that you need visuals for into the audio format, but you're a creative guy. I know you can do it. Now, one of the other things is that I know Jared specifically wrote this book for a non-academic audience, so he didn't want to write his work with references punctuating every single sentence or paragraph or chapter. However, there were some big ideas that I came across that I would have loved to have seen some of the references so I could have done further reading, but without the references or the sources of the ideas, I found it difficult to then go and extend my learning and my reading. So that's a minor bugbear, but something that's at least important to those of us who like to go a little bit deeper with our reading. With those small qualms aside, the book is an absolute blast to read. What makes it unique and special is that Jared discusses highly complex topics in a playful, fun, and easy to read manner. You'll hardly know that you're reading, you'll have to experience the book. and he's just so darn creative in how he communicates. For example, when you get a couple of chapters deep, I think in chapter 3, he has an entire section that's communicated in comic book form. And it's these kinds of novelties and ideas that made me polish off this book in just a couple of days when I first read it. And once you start reading it, you're going to become glued to the pages and you won't want to stop until the book ends, and then you'll revisit it time and time again. So in summary, I'd highly recommend purchasing this book. And while yes, I am somewhat partial to the author because I've known and been friends with Jared for years, I'm also happy to say that I've read hundreds of books on the science of learning and performance, and I think this is a bit of a game changer in the field. So this brings us to the conclusion of our review on the book Stop Talking, Start Influencing, 12 Insights from Brain Science to Make Your Message Stick by Dr. Jared Cooney-Horvath. Thanks for tuning in. If you found these insights helpful, give us a like and a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe if you don't want to miss out on more videos that talk about brain and the science of learning that can revolutionize your learning and communication skills. Until next time, keep learning. Thank you.